Hi, my name's Lorenzo. I am the designer of this gasifier that can help the average person make biochar at home or on their farm, simply turning yard debris into biochar. And you get to cook on this in the process. Can your vegetables from the last harvest and use the biochar to increase the yield of the next harvest. You can find my website, mycommunitycompost.com. Look me up on Facebook, Lorenzo Monduy Jr., and Smarter Farmers Inc. at Instagram. I started making biochar about a year ago, but I've been interested in building soil for the past 8 years, I think. It's funny how I got into it. I'm a combat veteran from the Iraq War, and I started investing in gold and silver when I was there. And then I lost a lot of money in the stock market in 2008. And I started searching for ways to find gold. Started taking geology classes. I got into environmental science that way. And I started to find that soil was more interesting than gold, because you can eat from the soil and you can't eat the gold. So I wanted to figure out, is there any opportunity for engineering in agriculture, for improvement in agriculture? And at first I was really discouraged, because I thought, well, we've got all these big machines, we've made so many advancements in agriculture, I don't think there's really much room for improvement. But I started to look towards waste transformation and water purification, because I felt like those were some big problems that we had with landfills and with water scarcity. And I wanted to go to UF and continue my education in engineering. So I bought some land in Ocala, about an hour from Gainesville, and I started just investing in my land, trying to figure out a way I was going to be able to grow food and be sustainable. So I was interested in aquaponics, and I thought there was no way possible to transform the soil, so I have to do aquaponics. But then I started to reach out to my community more and get to know my community, and one thing led to another, and I found a local source of mulch, and I found someone who was doing a community composting program in St. Augustine, and I took a class on composting to learn how to do that. And then I started my own composting program. I called it My Community Compost. And I went from about 25-mile radius all around me, and I collected food waste in 5-gallon buckets from restaurants and the community. And I started to use that free mulch to compost. And then some friend from the Army sent me a documentary on past civilizations. And somewhere in the middle of the video, there was like this quick 5-minute excerpt from the Amazon rainforest, where these natives were making this terra preta, this dark earth enhanced with biochar. And so then I just started to investigate that. And I investigated as much as I could, and I started looking for other people online who were doing the same thing. I joined some biochar groups on Facebook. I joined some other forums, and I learned as much as I could. I started following people on YouTube that were doing that, and then I started to make my own and mix that in. And I saw through my composting operation, because I was taking daily records of the temperatures, I was flipping the compost using the Berkeley method, 18-day composting, and I started to see a lot of improvements. And I was slow at first, but then I remembered that I had touched base with the UF IFAS extension service a little bit before I learned about biochar, and the guy there told me about biochar, and I thought it was just a novelty thing, something, oh, that's cool, yeah, ashes and stuff go into soil to make it better, I thought, but I didn't really get the big picture until I started to find it on my own. And then I went back to him and said, wow, you were right about that stuff. There's a lot of potential there. And we started talking more about that. And I showed him one of my gasifiers. And so I'm still in contact with him, and we might try to work together to spread this technology further. But that's pretty much how I got into it. And it's been super exciting because it feels to me like the one thing that I can focus on that will make the biggest difference. This is something that everybody can do, and it's like a grassroots movement that could have a lot of impact. And I'm just excited to share it and to try to see, you know, how much change can we make working together, all doing something similar.
What's your future goal?
Future goal. Well, I would love to consult. I would love to just link up with other organizations that have the same mindset of bringing permaculture to our communities and to improving our local food systems so that we can have stronger communities and we can be more resilient and less vulnerable to pressure from big banks and big corporations and all these people that really don't have a vested interest, I think, in our communities. And this is a way for us to kind of take our power back, I feel like. And it's ultimately just a fight for freedom for me. I joined the Army to fight for freedom. I went to Iraq and realized I wasn't really fighting for freedom, and it made me angry. And I wanted to continue to fight for freedom, and so this is where it's led me. And in the future, I hope to be able to travel as far and wide as possible and spread this to as many people as possible, and just continue to develop an infrastructure for more resilient communities. Biochar is an electrocarbon sponge. And if you're familiar with chemistry and carbon, you know it has 4 valence electrons. And it can attach to all kinds of things. That's why it makes grid structure in diamonds and graphite. And that's why it's the backbone of life on Earth. It's the building block of life. So that carbon in the biochar, it retains its relic form of the parent material. So it strips everything almost everything away except for the carbon. You're left with some minerals and carbon in here, but more importantly, you're left with the shape of the plant. And in bamboo, we have lots of tubes. So electrons can run down these pathways, and there's lots of surface area for minerals to attach onto and for cations to be exchanged, positive ions. So that's one of the reasons we have a huge problem with our soil here, is because it doesn't have a lot of carbon, it doesn't have a lot of organic matter, and it gets superheated, supercharged by the sun, and it tends to ionize and repel water and repel these things. But when we increase the cation exchange capacity of the soil, then we're able to retain water and minerals, nutrients better. So this will definitely help. But we want to increase the surface area as much as possible, so it helps to have the biochar crushed to a fine particle size, ideally less than a 1/4 inch, less than a rice grain size. And even so, at that small size, it has tremendous surface area, hundreds of square meters per gram. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why it's so beneficial. So it holds on to nutrients, water, microorganisms, makes it easier for these things to be exchanged in the soil, doesn't affect the soil's pH. In fact, it buffers the soil's pH. You'll want to fill these as dense as possible with limbs vertically. And then at the top, you don't want to put any material really higher than these holes. So go for this line right here and stack it as dense as you can. And then get a finer material up top, like twigs, more twigs, or even pine needles. Pine needles are some of the best. And then you just light it on fire with a lighter, and it should take off from there. And it will burn smokeless for most of the burn. And when it's done burning, you won't see any flames. That's how you'll know that all the gases are burnt off. And you'll be left with glowing red hot embers, which then, if you have some welding gloves or something, you can tip the container in and pour all the embers into a water trough or a container of water, or you could spray this down with water, pour a bucket of water in here. The only reason why you might not want to do that is because it will reduce the longevity of this gasifier, the more that it expands and contracts quickly with water quenching. But this will last a long time. My older models lasted over 50 burns. I think this will last a lot longer. The holes are smaller, so there's less to break apart when it does start corroding. So it's very simple to use. Now, if there is smoke, that means that it's not hot enough or there's not enough airflow. So sometimes if you stack this too densely, you'll want to make sure that there's some type of hole going through the center, like a channel going through the center, to help with the airflow. Now, if you have too big of material in here, then it's going to be harder to get it hot enough to keep the chain reaction going. And it is kind of like a chain reaction, because what happens is, as it lights on fire, the fire creates an updraft that sucks in air through these holes. And because these holes are above the holes down here, it creates a vacuum right here. And that causes the gases that are burning in here and being released from the biomass to be sucked down and then mix in this inner chamber here to come out here. And all these holes are angled to help with mixing of the air. And so what happens is you have a zone of combustion here that we call the pyrolysis zone. And the pyrolysis zone is a zone where oxygen is limited. And that zone moves down from the top down. And then everything becomes pyrolyzed or carbonized. And that's why it burns with no smoke. Now, once it's all done and burned at the bottom, you can add to it. You can keep adding to this. You can fill the whole thing up with char in a day, or less than a day. It depends how much you're feeding it. So if you keep feeding it and keep making char, you'll want to sometimes mix it around to make sure that all the pieces are burnt off. But you'll know that it's all burnt off when there's no flames. It'll just be glowing red hot embers. And if you do put more material inside, keep in mind the diameter of the material, the density of the material. If you put more dense material in here, it's going to take more twigs and things to get hot enough to burn that material up. Otherwise, you're going to be sacrificing the embers that you've created in order to fully combust those bigger pieces. So keep that in mind. If you're going to put some big stuff in here, you got to put a bunch of little stuff in here as well. Just today, for the first time, I made these flame concentrators. I was working on one with like this, but this I think is going to work better. It increases the draft, and it concentrates the gases so that there's a little bit more of a more efficient burn. And sometimes though with that one, it's slowed down to the point where it wasn't really burning so well. And if you just bring it over to the side like that, air rushes down here and it all comes up here. So if you want to, increase it, the velocity of it or the intensity of it, you just move it over to the side and then you can move it over here. And I have plenty of times put a grill grate over this and cooked on it. I've canned my vegetables, pickled radishes. It heats water really fast. I'm pretty sure that this burns in excess of 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's a lot you can do with it.
And what's the general timeline if you did want to do a fill of the whole bit for
Well,
a day?
I'd say if you were to fill it really well with a lot of as tightly as you could and get it going burning good, it would burn for an hour at least. Now you can keep putting it in and keep it burning all day until you've filled the whole thing up with char. And because what happens when you burn this, whatever you start with, your feedstock, you're only going to end up with about 1/3 of the material of the volume.
So this is going to shrink down to about a...
Yeah, to about, and then that's why you can keep adding to it, and you'll be able to fill the whole thing up with char. And that's what I love about this, is it slows down that process enough to where you can actually capture a lot of biochar. If you put a lid on here, then you'll stop the updraft, which will slow down the air coming in here, so it will cool everything. But there's still going to be some air coming in, so some of it will turn to ash, but I have been able to keep a lot of the char by just suffocating it that way. I'm not 100% sure that would be the most ideal situation. So I
flame
always
goes
put
out.
it out with water. That's what I do.
Flame goes out
Mm-hmm.
because you
Give it
want
a little mix. Make sure that there's no more unburnt material hiding under some of those coals, because a piece may have fallen and got trapped, and then it just needs to come to the surface to maybe burn off a little bit more gases. But if there's no more flames, then you can tell, yeah, it's all char, and you'll put it out with water, and you'll immediately be able to pick it up.
Is that gas?
Yes, this is propane gas, but I usually just need a bunch of pine needles and a lighter. It'll light really quickly. This is burning pretty well. I like this flame concentrator as opposed to this one. If I show you what happens. Now, without it, it doesn't need it. Right? It burns very well without it. And because there's enough energy in this, it doesn't seem to be slowing down too much with this flame concentrator. But like I said, I'm still developing these. So we can increase the chimney like this. So now it's time to put out. So we'll take some water and get this thing preserved. We will preserve those coals. This is important so that we can handle it. This, well, actually no.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll let it cool down a little bit more by itself. Because the only thing I didn't want to happen is for this to be so hot that it dries the water and then the coal combusts again. Because it can catch again if that happens.
Because it's that hot.
Right. So if you don't have enough water, it will just steam off. But here is some high quality biochar
Beautiful.
that we just made in a few minutes here.
Oh, wow.
And this will dry. It'll sound like metal clinking. And this is the electrocarbon sponge that we're going to use to manage carbon throughout the planet and increase our soil fertility.
All right, good stuff.
And look, we even have the cardboard box still preserved as char.
Are there any things in there that are better than others?
I think biochar, I mean the bamboo is
It always
probably the
comes out.
best
Yeah.
because it has all these little tubes through it that carry all the nutrients up to the top of the plant. So because of its structure like that, it I think has some of the easiest to use for microorganisms and nutrients and ions to travel across on the microscopic level. I turn every other day for 18 days. It's a total of 8 turns. It's very labor intensive. And you end up adding all that biochar because you turned it 8 times and you're adding every time biochar. And then I let it sit for 2 to 3 months. And during that time, it maintains above 131 degrees, in between 131 and 165 for over 15 consecutive days. And then it slowly comes down, it cures, and then it's all really rich biochar compost. That's I was selling for $10 for a 5-gallon bucket worth.
Oh wow.
And after it's sifted, it's the ideal seed starting mix. I have never grown better microgreens. They just are super healthy.
No pesticides.
No pesticides, nothing. Just compost and biochar.